Imagine, if you will, a soldier, his uniform caked with the fine abrasive dust of the North African desert, circa 1943. His throat is parched, sandpaper dry, each swallow an effort. The distant rumble of artillery, a constant companion, promises only more hardship, more hunger. For the Italian infantrymen, often under-equipped and perpetually operating on the razor's edge of starvation, the battle wasn't just against the British Eighth Army or the American Second Corps. It was a daily, brutal fight against a logistics chain that had all but crumbled. Their spirit, though resilient, was tested by the sheer, grinding reality of scarcity. What if the most profound defeat, the most impactful strategic blow, wasn't delivered by a tank column or an air raid, but by a simple chocolate bar? What if the very act of surrender led not to the expected privation, but to an encounter with an abundance so alien, so utterly unexpected, it reshaped an entire generation's understanding of power? In the next 40 minutes, we'll uncover exactly how this played out and why it still matters today. The conditions for many Italian units in North Africa were dire, a stark contrast to the romanticized image of a fascist war machine. Men like Private Enzo Rossi, serving in the Ariete Armored Division, faced shortages of everything from ammunition to basic rations. Their N-33 helmets offered meager protection. Their Carcano rifles were often outmatched, and the persistent lack of fuel and supplies meant their famed tanks, the M1340s, frequently sat idle, vulnerable targets in the vast, unforgiving expanses. By January 1943, after the pivotal battles of El Alamein and the Torch Landings, the Axis forces were cornered in Tunisia. Their supply lines stretched thin across the Mediterranean, constantly harried by Allied air and naval power. The logistical nightmare was not merely an inconvenience. It was a strategic choke point, slowly strangling their ability to fight, reducing proud soldiers to scavenging for scraps of food and water. When the final Allied push came in April and May of 1943, the collapse was swift and total. Thousands of Italian and German soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, laid down their arms. For these men, the prospect of captivity was grim, shaped by pre-war propaganda and the brutal realities of combat. They expected harsh treatment, meager sustenance, perhaps even outright cruelty. Their journey from the desolation of the North African front to the processing centers, and then onto the ships bound for America, was a blur of uncertainty and fear. They were leaving behind the dust and the desolation, but what awaited them across the Atlantic? They had been told of a decadent, soft America, a nation incapable of truly understanding the rigors of war. But the reality they would soon encounter would challenge every single one of those deeply ingrained beliefs. Over the course of the war, more than 425,000 Axis prisoners of war would eventually be held in American camps. Of those, over 50,000 were Italian, men who had fought in the harshest conditions imaginable. They were sent to places like Camp Gruber in Oklahoma, Camp McCain in Mississippi, and Camp Aliceville in Alabama. Names that meant nothing to them, just abstract points on a map of the enemy's homeland. These camps were not the brutal, unforgiving places they had been led to expect. Instead, they were miniature societies, often built from scratch, reflecting a logistical capacity that was, frankly, astounding to these new arrivals. The sheer scale of the operation, the speed with which these facilities were constructed and staffed, hinted at a deeper, almost unsettling power. What kind of nation could afford to build entire towns, complete with hospitals, mess halls, and recreational facilities for its prisoners in the midst of a global war? This question, unspoken, began to circulate among the captured men even before they fully understood the answer. They were about to witness a different kind of battlefield, one where the weapons were not steel and fire, but something far more subtle and ultimately more devastating to the enemy's narrative: The journey across the Atlantic had been a blur of cramped quarters and lingering anxieties, but nothing prepared them for the arrival. Stepping off the trains into the American heartland, the Italian prisoners were met not with the expected barbed wire and grin-faced guards, but with an almost disorienting sense of order and, more profoundly, abundance. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, for example, the first thing many noticed was not the watchful eyes of their captors, but the sheer size of the mess halls, the clean, tiled floors, and the tantalizing aromas that wafted from kitchens far more elaborate than any they had known in the field. This wasn't just food. It was a feast for senses accustomed to scarcity. The daily rations, a stark contrast to their meager wartime diet of hardtack and watered-down soup, now included fresh meat, vegetables, and even fruit. Men who had scraped by on less than 1,500 calories a day in North Africa were suddenly consuming over 3,000 calories, often more. The shock wasn't merely the quantity, but the quality. They found themselves served dishes like roast beef, mashed potatoes, and freshly baked bread, staples that were luxuries in wartime Italy, if available at all. It wasn't just sustenance. It was an unspoken declaration of a nation's capacity. This wasn't the decadent, starving America their propaganda had painted. This was a land of seemingly endless provisions. Beyond the basic necessities, the camps offered amenities that bordered on the fantastical for men who had lived in foxholes. Post exchanges, or PXs, allowed prisoners to purchase items with scrip earned from labor. Here, the true psychological warfare began. Not with bullets, but with Hershey's chocolate bars, a sweet luxury many had never tasted. Camel cigarettes, a universal currency of comfort, were readily available. Some camps, like Camp Gruber in Oklahoma, even boasted on-site ice cream churns, producing a treat so utterly alien to the privations of war that it became a legend among the prisoners. Imagine the sensory impact, the chill of the ice cream, the unfamiliar richness of the chocolate, the comforting burn of American tobacco. Each item was a tiny, tangible piece of a puzzle that didn't fit their preconceived notions. These seemingly minor details were, in fact, incredibly powerful forms of strategic communication. It wasn't a battle fought with tanks or planes, but with the subtle, pervasive message of unparalleled logistical capacity and economic resilience. By the end of 1944, tens of thousands of Italian POWs, distributed across dozens of camps from Camp McCain in Mississippi to facilities in California, were experiencing this reality daily. The sheer ability of the United States to not only feed its own massive war machine, but also to generously provision its enemies, even with luxuries, began to systematically dismantle the ideological underpinnings of the Axis cause. How could a nation so seemingly focused on consumer comforts possess such an unyielding ability to produce and distribute even to its enemies? This question, heavy and persistent, began to echo in the minds of these men. If you were an Italian soldier, having fought for years under the banner of a regime promising a new Roman Empire, only to be fed better as a prisoner than as a free man, what would you make of it? What would have been your decision at that point? Leave your thoughts in the comments on what you would do. The stark contrast wasn't lost on men who understood scarcity intimately. They had been told of Allied weakness, of an America too soft for real war, yet here they were, witnessing a nation that could afford generosity even in the crucible of global conflict. This wasn't merely about individual morale. It was about systematically eroding a narrative. The availability of these treats, the quality of the food, the very infrastructure of the camps, it all painted a picture of a nation with seemingly limitless resources. A nation whose power wasn't just military, but economic and industrial, capable of sustaining an effort on a scale unimaginable to their own leaders. This quiet, persistent message, delivered one chocolate bar at a time, was preparing the ground for a profound shift in perception. The shift in perception wasn't a sudden revelation, but a slow, undeniable erosion of deeply held beliefs, built brick by brick with every meal and every unexpected amenity. It began with the food, yes, but quickly extended to the very fabric of daily life within these American camps. The prisoners, accustomed to a rigid, often brutal military hierarchy, found a surprising degree of autonomy and even respect. Under the provisions of the 1929 Geneva Convention, which the United States rigorously observed, prisoners of war were not just to be housed and fed. They were to be treated humanely, allowed religious freedom, and given opportunities for recreation and education. This wasn't benevolence born purely of altruism. It was a strategic choice, rooted in international law and a pragmatic understanding of the long game. Many Italian POWs were put to work, not as forced labor, but as paid employees. They earned scrip, a special camp currency, for their efforts. By 1944, tens of thousands of Axis prisoners were contributing to the American war effort, picking cotton in Mississippi, harvesting potatoes in Maine, or working in canneries across the Midwest. This labor wasn't just about easing the domestic manpower shortage. It was another subtle yet profound message. These men, once soldiers of a nation that decried American capitalism as decadent, were now participants in its industrial and agricultural engine, earning wages and purchasing goods. The irony was not lost on them. The scrip they earned could be spent at the aforementioned PXs, a small general store within each camp. Here, the tangible symbols of American economic might were laid bare. Beyond the Hershey's chocolate and Camel cigarettes, prisoners could buy toiletries, writing paper, and even musical instruments. Imagine the scene at Camp Hearn, Texas, where Italian prisoners formed orchestras and theater groups, performing for their fellow captives and even local American audiences. This wasn't the grim, punitive incarceration they had braced for. This was a system that, while restricting their freedom, provided an unexpected level of comfort and even cultural enrichment. It forced a fundamental reevaluation of everything they thought they knew about their enemy. Beyond work and entertainment, many camps offered educational programs. Italian prisoners, some of whom had limited formal schooling, could attend classes taught by fellow POWs or even American civilians. They learned English, mathematics, and vocational skills. Libraries were stocked with books, providing access to ideas and information that might have been censored or unavailable in wartime Italy. This wasn't just about passing the time. It was about investing in the individual, fostering a sense of purpose and self-improvement that stood in stark contrast to the dehumanizing conditions of total war. It was a subtle yet powerful testament to a different kind of national character, one that valued education and personal development, even for its adversaries. The meticulous organization, the consistent supply of goods, the very infrastructure of these sprawling camps, they all spoke volumes. These facilities, often built quickly in remote areas, represented an unparalleled feat of logistical planning and industrial capacity. Take Camp Florence, Arizona, which housed thousands of prisoners, complete with its own hospital, vocational shops, and extensive recreational areas. The ability of the United States to not only wage a global war, but also to construct and maintain these self-contained miniature cities for its enemies, complete with amenities, was a physical manifestation of a power far beyond the Axis's capabilities. This wasn't just about treating prisoners well. It was about projecting an image of inexhaustible resources and an almost casual abundance, even in the midst of the greatest conflict in human history. This persistent, unspoken narrative began to systematically unravel the ideological foundations upon which the Axis war effort was built. The consistent provision of these comforts, day after day, week after week, began to chip away at the carefully constructed narratives of fascist Italy. These were men who had been told of American decadence, of a nation too soft, too focused on individual comforts to truly grasp the meaning of sacrifice or the iron will required for total war. Yet, here they were, witnessing a society that could not only wage war on an unprecedented global scale, but also extend a level of organized, almost casual generosity to its captured enemies. The dissonance was profound. For Private Enzo Rossi and thousands like him, the routine of camp life at places like Camp Aliceville became a living, breathing counter-narrative. The well-maintained barracks, the regular mail service, the access to medical care. These weren't just conveniences. They were tangible proofs of an underlying strength, a national infrastructure that defied their every expectation. By mid-1944, the network of American POW camps had grown to house a staggering number of Axis personnel, with Italian prisoners spread across more than 150 facilities, from the vast plains of Texas to the humid forests of Georgia. Each camp, a self-contained world, offered a consistent experience. They worked on farms, helping to alleviate the wartime labor shortages, or in non-military industries earning their scrip. This wasn't merely busy work. It was integration, however temporary, into the American economic engine. They saw how American farms, despite the war, produced food in such abundance that it could feed not only the nation, but also its prisoners. They witnessed the efficiency of American industry, even in the smallest details of camp administration. This wasn't the image of a struggling nation. It was a testament to an almost limitless productive capacity. The psychological impact of this sustained exposure cannot be overstated. Imagine being taught for years that your enemy is weak, materialistic, and incapable of true dedication, only to find yourself a recipient of their organized benevolence. The initial shock of the Hershey bar or the ice cream gave way to a deeper, more insidious form of doubt. How could a nation so seemingly soft possess such formidable organizational power? How could a people so focused on individual comfort maintain such a vast, efficient war machine? The questions were not posed by their captors. They arose internally, fueled by the daily reality that contradicted their ingrained beliefs. This was a form of soft power, subtle but relentless, a quiet erosion of ideology. This wasn't just about food or amenities. It extended to the very culture of the camps. Italian prisoners, often with rich artistic traditions, were encouraged to form bands, put on plays, and create art. At Camp Florence, Arizona, prisoners sculpted intricate figures from desert clay. In Camp Crossville, Tennessee, they staged operas and built elaborate gardens. These activities, far from being mere distractions, became outlets for expression and a means of preserving identity, but also subtly reinforced the American approach to human dignity even in captivity. It was a stark contrast to the dehumanizing conditions often faced by prisoners on other fronts, or indeed, the severe discipline within their own armies. The Geneva Convention, a document largely ignored by some belligerents, became a cornerstone of their daily lives, providing a framework of rights and expectations. The experience of earning wages and spending scrip at the PX also offered a unique window into American consumer culture. For men from a wartime economy of rationing and shortages, the variety and availability of goods, however basic, was a revelation. They could choose their own soap, select their own tobacco, or even save for a small gift to send home through the International Red Cross. This seemingly mundane act of choice, of consumer agency, was a quiet yet powerful demonstration of an economic system that, despite the war, still prioritized a degree of individual liberty and material comfort. It was a stark, undeniable visual argument against the Axis propaganda that painted America as a decaying capitalist behemoth on the verge of collapse. The contrast between the propaganda they'd absorbed and the reality they now lived created a deep-seated cognitive dissonance. Their leaders had promised a new Roman Empire, a world order built on sacrifice and martial glory, but delivered scarcity and eventual defeat. America, the supposed land of degenerate individualism, delivered an abundance that seemed to defy the very logic of wartime. This wasn't just about winning hearts. It was about systematically undermining the minds of thousands, one small, unexpected kindness at a time. The seeds of a new understanding were being sown, not through overt re-education, but through the lived experience of a contrasting reality. What kind of nation could afford such a display of power, even to its enemies? This question continued to resonate. The answer to that resonating question, what kind of nation could afford such a display of power, even to its enemies, was precisely the turning point. This wasn't a weakness, a decadence, or a sign of America being soft, as Axis propaganda had vehemently declared. Instead, this boundless capacity to produce, distribute, and even extend comforts to its adversaries became the most potent psychological weapon in the Allied arsenal. It was the ultimate inversion of premises, a strategic masterstroke delivered not by a general's command, but by the quiet hum of a refrigerator and the rustle of a chocolate wrapper. Imagine it like this. The Axis ideology was a grand, meticulously constructed edifice built on foundations of scarcity, sacrifice, and the promise of a glorious, disciplined future. Propaganda was the mortar, holding every brick in place, reinforcing the belief that the soft Western democracies were crumbling, incapable of true martial spirit or sustained effort. But the American POW camps were like a constant, subtle tremor, a slow, insistent vibration that began to loosen that mortar, brick by brick. Each Hershey bar, each fresh apple, each warm meal wasn't just sustenance. It was an undeniable, tangible piece of evidence that directly contradicted the core tenets of their belief system. The very abundance they were told was a sign of weakness became, in their lived experience, the clearest demonstration of an unparalleled strength. This wasn't about converting individual soldiers to American democracy overnight. It was far more systemic. The impact was that of a slow-acting acid, steadily dissolving the ideological underpinnings of the enemy's cause, one treat at a time. For men like Enzo Rossi, who had faced starvation on the North African front, the sheer availability of items like Camel cigarettes or the occasional ice cream churned on-site at Camp Aliceville, Alabama, wasn't just a luxury. It was a profound, almost disorienting experience. By the war's end, over 50,000 Italian prisoners alone would pass through these camps, each carrying this first-hand, undeniable proof of a nation's immense, almost casual productive power. This daily, inescapable exposure to American logistical might and economic resilience began to systematically dismantle the narrative they had fought and suffered for. Their leaders had promised a new Roman Empire, a world forged in iron and will, yet struggled to feed their own troops. America, supposedly a nation of shopkeepers and individualists, could not only mobilize millions, but also provide a level of comfort to its prisoners that far exceeded what many of them had known as free men. The contrast was stark, undeniable, and deeply unsettling. It wasn't a battle fought with tanks or planes in these camps, but with a pervasive message of unparalleled capacity. Hold on to this detail for a moment, because it redefines everything that comes next. The profound question that began to circulate among these men wasn't about military tactics, but about the very nature of power itself. How could a nation so seemingly focused on consumer comforts possess such an unyielding ability to produce and distribute, even to its enemies, and on such a global scale? The answer, slowly dawning on them, was that the economic and industrial engine that drove American consumerism was precisely the same engine that fueled its war machine. The ability to churn out thousands of cars was directly linked to the ability to churn out thousands of tanks. The infrastructure that delivered fresh food to every corner of America could also deliver it to dozens of POW camps, simultaneously supporting a massive fighting force overseas. This wasn't a flaw in the American system. It was its foundational strength, a quiet, almost invisible force multiplier that the Axis leadership had catastrophically underestimated. This realization, spreading through the camps from Camp Gruber to Camp McCain, was the true turning point, reshaping understanding not just of their captors, but of the entire global conflict. The Italian soldiers, once proud warriors of a regime that championed austerity and martial sacrifice, were now living proof of a different kind of might. They saw it in the endless rows of identical barracks, built with astonishing speed. They felt it in the warmth of the mess halls, the steady supply of hot water, and the very air of organized efficiency that permeated every aspect of camp life. This wasn't just about individual treats. It was about the seamless operation of an entire system, from the farms producing their food to the factories churning out their beds. The Axis propaganda had painted a picture of America as a chaotic, self-indulgent society incapable of sustained, disciplined effort. Yet, here was a nation that could not only sustain a global war, but also manage the welfare of hundreds of thousands of enemy combatants with a level of logistical prowess that dwarfed their own nation's capabilities. Consider the sheer scale. By late 1944, the American war machine was operating on multiple fronts across the globe, from the Pacific to Western Europe. Simultaneously, it managed a domestic network of over 150 prisoner-of-war camps, each requiring staff, security, provisions, and infrastructure. This wasn't a small, isolated effort. This was an extension of the same industrial might that built Liberty ships in days and B-29 bombers in weeks. The consistency of supply, the quality of life, the mere fact that a nation at war could afford such a vast, organized display of generosity to its enemies spoke volumes. It was a tangible, undeniable demonstration of a foundational strength that went far beyond mere military hardware. Their understanding of power itself was being fundamentally recalibrated. For men like Private Enzo Rossi, who had witnessed the logistical collapse of the Italian army firsthand, this was an education unlike any other. He recalled the desperate searches for fuel for their M13/40 tanks in North Africa, the constant hunger, the uniforms patched and repatched until they were threadbare. Now, in Camp Aliceville, Alabama, he had a clean uniform, regular meals, and access to a library. The contrast was not merely physical, it was intellectual and psychological. The enemy they had been taught to despise as weak and materialistic was, in fact, demonstrating a material abundance and organizational capacity that bordered on the miraculous. This wasn't just propaganda, it was lived experience, etched into their daily routines. The subtle, pervasive message was clear. America's strength wasn't just in its soldiers or its weapons, but in its underlying economic engine, its infrastructure, and its ability to mobilize resources on an unimaginable scale. This was the true virata. The very elements the Axis had mocked as signs of decadence, the consumer culture, the emphasis on comfort, were revealed as symptoms of an industrial capacity so vast it could afford to be generous even to its foes. This generosity wasn't a weakness. It was a projection of power so overwhelming that it didn't need to resort to brutality to assert dominance. It simply demonstrated its inexhaustible capacity. Day after day, one full plate and one Hershey bar at a time. This redefinition of power had profound implications. It began to sow seeds of doubt about the entire Axis narrative. If their leaders struggled to feed their own troops, how could they possibly win against a nation that could feed and house its enemies so comfortably? The ideological purity, the martial glory, the promise of a new order, all began to ring hollow when confronted with the reality of American efficiency and abundance. The prisoners, many of whom were simple farmers or laborers, understood resource management at a fundamental level. They saw that America was not just fighting a war, it was simultaneously running a highly productive society that seemed immune to the privations of conflict. This realization wasn't an immediate conversion, but a slow internal shift. It was a quiet, personal reckoning with the truth. They observed American guards who, while firm, were not cruel. They saw the respect for regulations, the adherence to the Geneva Convention, which ensured their basic rights. This wasn't the image of a brutal, tyrannical enemy. It was a complex, almost contradictory picture of a nation that could be both incredibly powerful and surprisingly humane. This duality challenged their black and white worldview, forcing them to reevaluate their understanding of the world and their place in it. The impact was systemic, subtly influencing their perception not just of America, but of the very nature of political systems and national strength. They were being shown, through their own captivity, a different model of societal organization and power. The experience of these Italian POWs, then, became a living, breathing testament to the idea that true strength wasn't just about military might, but about the bedrock of a nation's economy and its values. It was about the ability to sustain an effort, to provide, to organize, even in the most challenging circumstances. This lesson, absorbed through daily life in the camps, would travel far beyond the barbed wire fences. It would shape their conversations, their memories, and ultimately, their perspectives on the post-war world. What would these men tell their families and communities when they eventually returned to a war-torn Italy about the enemy who fed them chocolate? How would these quiet observations influence the rebuilding of a nation? When the war finally ended and the long journey home began, these Italian prisoners of war carried more than just their meager belongings. They carried memories that defied easy categorization, experiences that clashed violently with the narratives they had been fed for years. Returning to a devastated Italy, a nation scarred by conflict and ideological collapse, their stories of American abundance and relative benevolence stood in stark contrast to the grim reality around them. They had witnessed the true might of a nation that could not only win a global war, but also manage the welfare of hundreds of thousands of enemy combatants with a level of logistical prowess that often surpassed their own nation's capabilities, even in peacetime. These were men who in 1943 had faced the harsh realities of a crumbling logistics chain in North Africa, often fighting on empty stomachs, their uniforms tattered. Now they spoke of regular hot meals, of clean barracks, of the unexpected luxury of Hershey bars and Camel cigarettes. Imagine the conversations in small Italian villages, among families rebuilding their lives. While others recounted tales of fierce battles and brutal privation, these former POWs offered a different perspective, one of an enemy nation that, despite being at war, seemed to possess an almost infinite capacity for production and distribution. This wasn't overt propaganda. It was the quiet, undeniable testimony of lived experience shared around kitchen tables and in village squares. The impact was subtle, yet profound. It wasn't about converting them to American ideology, but about systematically dismantling the ideological underpinnings of the fascist cause they had once served. Their leaders had promised a new Roman Empire, built on sacrifice and martial glory, but delivered scarcity and eventual defeat. America, the supposed land of degenerate individualism, had delivered an abundance that defied the very logic of wartime. This cognitive dissonance, nurtured in the camps, became a powerful unspoken force in post-war Italy. It fostered a quiet admiration, a foundational respect for American capabilities that would subtly influence the nation's political and cultural trajectory for decades. This experience subtly influenced post-war perceptions, fostering a quiet admiration that would lay groundwork for future diplomatic and cultural ties, far more effectively than any overt propaganda campaign could have. The sheer scale of it, with over 50,000 Italian prisoners passing through American camps by the war's end, meant that these individual stories coalesced into a collective understanding. They formed a network of first-hand witnesses, spreading a narrative of American strength, not just in military terms, but in its economic resilience and, surprisingly, its relative benevolence. This was a testament to a different kind of power, one that could afford generosity even in the crucible of global conflict. The very notion of power, for these men, had been redefined. It was no longer solely about martial prowess or ideological purity. It was about the ability to sustain, to provide, to organize on an unimaginable scale, even for one's enemies. The American system, which could churn out thousands of cars and simultaneously deliver fresh food and treats to dozens of POW camps, all while supporting a massive fighting force overseas, presented a compelling, undeniable argument. It was a silent, pervasive message of unparalleled logistical capacity and economic resilience that resonated far deeper than any battlefield victory. These men returned with a new lens through which to view the world, one shaped by the stark contrast between scarcity and abundance, between rhetoric and reality. The long-term effects of this psychological reprogramming were far-reaching. As Italy began to rebuild its shattered nation, the memories and perceptions carried by these former prisoners contributed to a broader societal shift. They had seen firsthand a model of efficiency and productivity that was deeply impressive. This wasn't merely about individual morale. It was about systematically dismantling the ideological underpinnings of the enemy's cause, one treat at a time, and replacing it with a nuanced, often admiring understanding of a different global power. The seeds of a new understanding were sown, not through overt re-education, but through the lived experience of a contrasting reality, influencing future generations and shaping Italy's place in the post-war world. This new understanding wasn't merely academic, it was deeply personal, etched into the memory of every man who returned. Imagine the conversations, a farmer from Tuscany, once a soldier of Mussolini, now recounting how his American captors, the supposed decadent enemies, provided him with more consistent and nutritious meals than he'd ever received from his own army. These stories, shared in piazzas and homes across Italy, subtly but profoundly reshaped the popular perception of America. It wasn't the image of a distant, abstract superpower, but of a nation capable of immense generosity, underpinned by an even more immense industrial might. This wasn't about love for America. It was about respect, born from undeniable evidence. The sheer capacity to wage a global war while simultaneously maintaining a high standard of living for its own population, and even for its prisoners, spoke volumes. It was a stark, tangible contrast to the fascist ideal of a nation forged in iron and sacrifice, which had ultimately delivered only privation and defeat. The virata wasn't just in their individual minds. It was a societal shift, a quiet reevaluation of what constituted true national strength. This collective memory, passed down and reinforced, became a subtle but powerful current in the nascent post-war Italian democracy. Consider the geopolitical landscape of the late 1940s. With Europe devastated and the Cold War brewing, nations were forced to choose sides, both ideologically and economically. For Italy, a country grappling with the legacy of fascism and the devastation of war, the experiences of these 50,000-plus former POWs served as an unexpected, organic form of soft power. Their first-hand accounts of American efficiency, organization, and even a surprising level of humanitarianism provided a counter-narrative to Soviet propaganda, which painted the United States as an exploitative capitalist behemoth. This wasn't an explicit lobbying effort. It was the quiet weight of personal testimony. The availability of items like Hershey's chocolate bars, Camel cigarettes, or the occasional ice cream churned on-site at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, became powerful symbols. They represented not just individual comforts, but the visible tip of an economic iceberg, an unparalleled logistical capacity that could produce, distribute, and maintain abundance even under wartime conditions. This wasn't about military might in the traditional sense, but about a deeper, more pervasive form of power, the power of a resilient economy, a robust infrastructure, and a society capable of sustained, organized effort on a global scale. This was the true engine that drove American influence. These former prisoners, having seen this system up close, understood that the very consumer culture the Axis had derided was in fact the wellspring of American strength. The factories that made refrigerators could make tanks. The transportation networks that moved goods across a continent could move armies across oceans. This realization fostered a pragmatic respect for American industrial prowess, a respect that would prove invaluable as Italy sought to rebuild its economy and align itself within the Western Bloc. It was a critical, albeit subtle, factor in Italy's post-war alignment with the United States and its participation in initiatives like the Marshall Plan, which poured billions into European recovery, further solidifying these bonds. This quiet admiration wasn't taught in schools. It was absorbed through family stories, through the collective consciousness of a generation that had seen the stark difference between two competing worldviews. It was a foundational layer beneath the surface of official diplomacy that allowed for deeper cultural exchange and cooperation. The idea that a nation could be both incredibly powerful and surprisingly benevolent, even to its enemies, challenged deeply ingrained prejudices and opened minds to new possibilities. This nuanced understanding, forged in the unlikely setting of a prisoner of war camp, became a silent but incredibly powerful form of strategic communication, shaping perceptions for decades to come. What these Italian soldiers experienced in American camps wasn't just a moment in time. It was a profound lesson in the nature of power itself. It taught them that true strength isn't always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it's the quiet hum of a well-oiled machine, the consistent provision of basic necessities, and the unexpected kindness shown to an adversary. It was a testament to a different kind of power, one that could afford generosity even in the crucible of global conflict, a power that could subtly dismantle an empire's narrative one treat at a time. The echoes of those quiet moments in the American heartland would reverberate far beyond the war's end, influencing the very fabric of post-war international relations and cultural exchange. How these lessons continue to shape our world today is a story worth exploring. The echoes of those quiet moments in the American heartland would reverberate far beyond the war's end, influencing the very fabric of post-war international relations and cultural exchange. How these lessons continue to shape our world today is a story worth exploring. The hungry Italian soldier, once caked in North African dust, found more than just food in America's camps. he found an undeniable truth: that the true measure of a nation's strength isn't solely in its ability to wage war, but in its capacity to sustain, to provide, and even to extend a surprising measure of humanity to its adversaries. This wasn't a lesson taught in classrooms or through propaganda leaflets. It was etched into the daily routine of over 50,000 men in camps like Aliceville, Alabama, and Gruber, Oklahoma. They learned that the very consumer culture their leaders had scorned was in fact the visible manifestation of an industrial and logistical engine so vast it could afford generosity even in the crucible of global conflict. This subtle, systemic message, delivered one Hershey bar and one hot meal at a time, quietly dismantled the ideological foundations of a regime built on scarcity and martial sacrifice. It fostered a quiet admiration, a pragmatic respect for American capabilities that would prove invaluable as Italy navigated the treacherous waters of post-war reconstruction and geopolitical realignment. These former prisoners became unwitting ambassadors of American soft power, their personal testimonies reshaping perceptions and laying the groundwork for enduring diplomatic and cultural ties. It was a testament to a different kind of power, one that could afford benevolence even to its enemies, and in doing so, win a battle for hearts and minds far from any front line. Ultimately, the humble treat, offered in the unexpected setting of an enemy camp, proved to be a more profound strategic instrument than any overt propaganda, subtly redefining what true national strength truly meant and influencing the trajectory of nations for generations. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful messages are delivered not through grand pronouncements, but through consistent, undeniable actions. These stories underscore a timeless truth: that the ability to provide, to organize, and to maintain dignity, even amidst global conflict, speaks volumes about a society's resilience and its values. If this deep dive into a forgotten corner of history made you rethink what you thought you knew about World War II, subscribe now to not miss the next chapter of Untold Stories. Leave a like to let me know that exploring these nuanced pathways is a journey worth continuing. And tell me in the comments, what part of this story truly turned the key for you? I'll be reading and weaving those insights into our next exploration. And if I told you that the impact of these camps extended even to the very design of post-war aid programs, would you want to see how?